It's a great pleasure for me to introduce Gil Stein. I can remember the day I first met him when the AOS was in Yale and he was still an undergraduate, which was quite a few years ago. And we have since crossed paths several times, but I remember most particularly in the Urfa area one day where we went shopping for drawing boards for Hacınebi. I don't know if he remembers that, but I do. Gil received his PhD at Penn in 1988 and moved to Northwestern University. He then moved from the north side of Chicago to the south side, where he became director of the Oriental Institute between 2002 and 2017. Most of you here, I think many of you here, know his work on rethinking world systems and colonialism. I was thinking today, driving in, how would I describe his work in one sentence? So here I go. I would say that it's theoretically informed empirical data collection aimed at studying that elusive complexity that we see growing in the ancient Near East. So that's one sentence, a long one, but it's the best I could do. In Rethinking World Systems, he changed the way people looked at how the Uruk world, the early Mesopotamian world, controlled the outer regions or the periphery of their areas and gave us a more nuanced explanation, I think, than the world systems one. His excavations have included Hacınebi, which he's going to return to now, a little different period, Tel Zaydan in northern Syria, and most recently in Sureja in Iraq, not far from Erbil, about 25, 30 kilometers. All of these fall in the range of about 5,000 BC to 3,800, 3,200 maybe, and at Hacınebi with a little poke of Achaemenid, which he'll talk about later. He's also published a number of articles on colonialism, ancient colonialism, and I can still remember being on the site of Hacınebi one day, and he said, ceramic apartheid, that's what we have here, ceramic apartheid. And he was looking really at the relationship of the growth of local cultures and their interface with Mesopotamian ones. In this case, in his talk today, he will deal with Achaemenids or Persians, burials, material culture, and imperial identities in the Euphrates Valley, 5th to 4th centuries BC. And this is a completely different topic than most of his work, but I see very close similarities. And some people here who've studied with me know that I feel like the Achaemenid period along the Euphrates needs a good synthetic study. So I'm hoping today that some of you might be stimulated to go forth in that direction. So it's with great pleasure that I welcome Gil Stein to speak to us on Achaemenids or Persians.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth, and I wanted to thank all of you, and especially the Portavood Center for inviting me to speak with you today. I know many of you are familiar with the Persian concept of ta'aruf, that sort of exaggerated politeness, but I always have to say, this isn't ta'aruf when I say that. This isn't ta'aruf when I say that institutions like the Portavood Center have never been more important than they are now. That Iranian studies in the US is so much at risk, and the importance of maintaining that flame cannot be overstated. This is really vital work that the center is doing, and I wanted to wish all of you every success in growing the Institute and in reaching out to educate new audiences, not just in the Iranian American community, but in the broader American society, as to why they should care, why Iranian studies is so important, and that it really is a part of who we are as a civilization. And that also is something that cannot be overestimated. So thank you for having me be a part of that. As Elizabeth Carter mentioned, I'm a prehistorian. Basically, once people start writing, I lose interest. But what's happened to me over time is I've come to realize that what I would refer to the spät und schlecht periods, the late and bad periods, actually, the more I've learned about them, the more fascinating I've realized that they've become, and that our ability to answer serious, fundamental, theoretical questions is so much improved by being able to look at periods, historically documented periods like the Achaemenid period, the Hellenistic period, and of course the Parthian Sasanian period as well, that we can really gain true insights because of being able to integrate all these different data sources. So for me, yes, this is kind of an experiment that to sort of delve into later periods, but I think it's really important to try to do, and I think the rewards that can come out of it are great. The Persian or Achaemenid Empire was founded by Cyrus the Great in 550 BC, and it developed into the largest polity known in the world up to that time, and it lasted for over 2 centuries until its destruction by Alexander the Great in 330 BC. At its zenith, the great kings of Persia ruled over 50 million subject people in 20 provinces or satrapies over a vast area extending from the Scythian steppes of Central Asia to the deserts of Nubia and the Nile Valley, and from Thrace in Europe as far east as the Indus Valley. It's an area that's estimated at about 8.5 million square kilometers, encompassing by at least one estimate, something like 44% of the world's estimated population at that time. So this was an enormous empire, totally unprecedented in history up to that time. It was a highly centralized bureaucratic state with enormous wealth, natural resources, and population. Unfortunately, our knowledge of the Achaemenid Empire has been distorted by the fact that our main textual sources, Greek historical works and the Old Testament, were written either by the Persian Empire's enemies or by its subject people. And with very few exceptions, we never really hear the voices of the Persians themselves. How was this enormous empire organized? How did the 50 million diverse people in the 20 satrapies relate to each other, and how did they fit into the broader framework of the Achaemenid state? This would seem to be an ideal area for archaeology to make a major contribution by recovering the traces of the actual behavior of the actors themselves. However, only in the last few decades have archaeologists begun to develop a better understanding of the material culture of this period and the ways that we can use it to understand the political, economic, and ideological structures that underlay the functioning of the Persian Empire, and above all, the relationship between the rulers and their many subject peoples. 2 Persian-period burials at the site of Hacınebi, and you can see that they're on the map, near the Euphrates River crossing in southeast Turkey, provide a rare opportunity to investigate the complex relationship between material culture and elite identity in the multi-ethnic Persian Empire. In today's talk, I want to compare these Hacınebi tombs, these 2 burials, with burials from other parts of the Persian Empire to see whether they reflect actual Persian ethnic identity as opposed to what I would like to call portable elite material culture used by local non-Persian elites in the satrapies. By considering the Hacınebi burials and their grave goods in the light of archaeology, history, and art history, we can reconstruct the complex hybrid identities and cultural koine that linked Persian and non-Persian elites across the cosmopolitan Achaemenid Empire. The 3.3 hectare mound of Hacınebi is a multi-period site located on a bluff overlooking the Euphrates River near the modern town of Birecik in southeast Turkey. The three rules of real estate, as you probably know, are location, location, and location. And Hacınebi is strategically located at the juncture of two of the most important routes of trade and communication in the Near East. The first of these arteries is the Euphrates itself, the main north-south trade route linking the Anatolian highlands with Syria and southern Mesopotamia. Hacınebi also sits on the major east-west crossing point of the Euphrates, close to the paired bridge towns of Zeugma and Apamea in the area where the Achaemenid royal road passed on its way to Sardis. In 6 seasons of excavation at Hacınebi, we identified 7 main occupations at the site, ranging from the Chalcolithic period up through Roman times. Achaemenid materials were recovered in the southeast corner of the site, sealed off by Hellenistic occupational strata dating to the late 4th and 2nd centuries BC. The earliest Hellenistic architectural complex overlay 2 Achaemenid burials, the ones I want to focus on today. The fact that both burials were stratigraphically sealed and never looted gives us a very rare opportunity to examine Achaemenid elite burial practices and their cultural meaning. The first of these burials was Tomb 28. This was an elaborate cist burial covered with flat limestone slabs. The cist, or burial box, was built of mud bricks on one side and limestone slabs on the other. Inside, there was a single adult burial. The bones were poorly preserved, so the sex of the individual could not be determined. The burial contained a rich variety of elaborate grave goods. Above the head were a round bronze mirror, a bronze pin, an Egyptian-style alabastron, a necklace made of glass carnelian and shell beads, 2 trilobe arrowheads, bronze tweezers, and a paste scaraboid seal with a griffin image, which you see up at the top. The body itself was bedecked with jewelry. On the right side of the skull were 2 penannular flat silver earrings with knob decorations. That's these ones here. Around the neck were 2 necklaces. The first was made of small beads of carnelian, gold, silver, bronze, stone, and faience. The second was a beautiful silver filigree double chain necklace with a crescent-shaped silver pendant and pomegranate-shaped silver beads. That's what you're seeing right there. On the rib cage, there were 3 silver rings, one with a winged lion or griffin motif, which you see over here. The 2 silver bracelets were placed on the right forearm of the body. The first was a penannular bracelet with zoomorphic terminals representing deer or calf heads. I love being able to say penannular bracelet with zoomorphic terminals, because then I can pretend to be an art historian, which I'm not. But it's penannular, meaning it's not a complete ring, and these are the terminals, the zoomorphic terminals. A second silver bracelet was annular with a rosette centerpiece and really beautiful granulated decoration over there. 4 silver and 3 bronze rings adorned the fingers of the right hand. The left arm also had 3 silver rings and 2 silver bracelets. The second one of these bracelets was really remarkable in having an elaborate filigree flat chain band with 2 pairs of lions flanking a rosette clasp. So there you see this flat filigree, and you can see 2 pairs of lions flanking this rosette. It's a really elaborate, fine piece of jewelry. A shallow bronze bowl was placed next to the knees, and 2 ceramic vessels were set at the feet of the deceased. Tomb 28 can be dated by parallels to the cemetery at the nearby site of Devehuyuk, and through the stylistic similarities of the winged lion or griffin signet ring to the 5th century seal impressions from the Persian period deposits at Ur. The Hellenistic building complex also overlay a second tomb, Tomb 38, and this one consisted of a deep rectangular pit with a mud brick cist with a corbelled roof. The cist enclosed a baked clay bathtub-shaped coffin, which you see here. The coffin is oval in plan with straight sides and a heavy flat rim and finger-impressed decorated bands. Analysis of the skeletal remains in this one determined that the deceased was a young adult woman, about between 25 and 30 years old. The skeleton showed signs of an infection on the leg bones, but we don't know if this was the cause of her death. Grave goods had been placed both on the body and around it. Against the south side of the coffin, between the knees and arms of the deceased, were 2 small stone alabastra. That's this very distinctive kind of vessel that's an Egyptian-style vessel. Behind the neck and rib cage were a red-striped cylindrical jar, a round cast bronze disc mirror, you can see that there, and a badly shattered tortoiseshell rattle. Near the back of the pelvis were 2 sets of gilded silver rings, over there, fused together in a straight line. With these ring sets were 2 gilded silver beads, and they may all have been part of an ornamented belt, these silver beads here. The forelimb of a sheep or goat was placed as a food offering between the upraised hands and head of the deceased. There was also a necklace with 75 stone, glass, and frit beads and bronze coin-shaped pendants. So a lot of jewelry was also found associated with the body proper. There were silver earrings on either side of the skull, and then the shin bones each had silver bronze alloy anklets with finely detailed calf's head terminals. So here you see these anklets. You can see they're much larger than the bracelets, and you can see that the terminals overlap with each other, unlike the penannular one. So again, this tomb, both Tomb 28 and 38, they're both dated stylistically to the 5th century BC with very good parallels. So when we compare them, these 2 contemporaneous tombs share a number of characteristics. They both have a roofed-over burial cist. They're both oriented to the cardinal points. They're both articulated primary burials of a single individual. They're both fairly rich. They have a lot of grave goods, including those in precious metals, such as silver, gold, and silver bronze alloy. And some types of grave goods are present in both burials: bronze mirrors, alabastra, ceramic storage vessels, earrings, bead necklaces, and other personal ornaments. But at the same time, the burials are different in some ways, although it's really hard to determine how important those differences were. But one that I do want to point out to you, 2 actually differences I want to point out to you, is that the first one, Tomb 28, on this side, had about twice as many grave goods as Burial 38. And Tomb 28 contained 2 arrowheads and also these penannular bracelets. And by contrast, the woman's burial, 38, had anklets but didn't have either weapons or bracelets. So penannular bracelets and jewelry, more generally, were a common form of adornment for high-ranking males within the Persian Empire. So when you look at the Persepolis reliefs, what you'll see is, here you can see the 2 zoomorphic terminals on this guy's penannular bracelet. They're all wearing bracelets, but if you look at their feet, none of them are wearing anklets. And that seems to be the case in at least the reliefs that I was able to look at, and please correct me if I have that wrong. The Greek historian Arrian tells us that Cyrus the Great was buried at Pasargadae, adorned not only with gold materials, embroidered cloths, and daggers, but also with necklaces, bracelets, and pendants made of gems and gold. Similarly, penannular bracelets with zoomorphic terminals are common on the Persian and Median soldiers depicted in these reliefs. So from the skeletal evidence, we can identify the individual in burial 38 as female. And based on these differences in grave goods, it's very tempting to hypothesize that the individual with the arrowheads and the bracelets was male. But there is a problem with trying to determine that, and that is when you do gender attribution based on just grave goods, we can't really distinguish between grave offerings that the mourners placed in the burial as opposed to stuff that the buried individual was actually wearing. They all get kind of mixed. In some cases you can tell, but often you cannot. So to be careful, I would say that the sex of the person in tomb 28 remains undetermined. We're on much safer ground in saying that both were tombs of elite or high status people. This interpretation is borne out by comparison with other Persian period sites such as Tel Michal in Israel, where very few of the 121 excavated burials had rich grave goods, and the vast majority were simple pit burials with no grave goods at all. At Tel Michal, the burials with the rich grave goods were roofed over cist graves that very closely resemble the Hacınebi tomb 28. In trying to understand who was interred in the Hacınebi burials, we have to consider two very different concepts. One is burial forms, and the other is burial goods. These two lines of evidence do not necessarily convey the same information about a person's social identity. The burial goods in the Hacınebi burials form part of a complex of what we can call portable elite material culture. And this was a complex, a set of artifacts, objects, that was very widely distributed in the Persian Empire, and it was shared both by local provincial elites and by their Persian overlords. At the same time, burial forms, as opposed to the burial goods, burial forms show a lot of regional variation, especially when we compare Persia itself with the Western satrapies such as Egypt, the Levant, and Anatolia. So, for example, the idea of bathtub coffins, it's a great name. Bathtub coffins are actually very common in a very ancient Iranian tradition that goes back to the Old Elamite period in the late 3rd millennium BC, and that we see it in a number of different sites, at Chogamish, at Susa, and at Haftepe. So these bathtub coffins are common in both Mesopotamia and Iran. But in contrast, other burial forms are very different in other parts of the Persian Empire. So there are rock-cut tombs in the Phoenician tradition along the Levantine coast, and pillar tombs are very common in Lycia in Anatolia. Some burial forms, like cist burials, do cross-cut large areas of the empire, so that's kind of the exception to the rule. In the Persian period, bathtub coffins, either made out of ceramic or out of bronze, are most common in Mesopotamia and Iran, and they occur frequently as far west as the Euphrates River Valley in Syria and southeast Anatolia. In Mesopotamia, bathtub coffins really come into play during the Assyrian period, the Neo-Assyrian period, and continue in the Neo-Babylonian and into the Persian period. And there are two main shapes of them. The Assyrian ones very often are rounded at one end, flattened at the other, and later on they're mostly of this oval shape. So you can kind of date them, the bathtub coffins, even though they're very common in Mesopotamia and Iran, because they do change over time. And one of the neat ways that they do change is in their proportions. So they start off being very deep, and then they end up getting shallower and longer over time. So you see there's this progression from the earlier ones being taller, and they go down and are much shallower and longer in later periods. And our tombs from Hacınebi, which are dating to the 5th century, fall kind of in the middle. So the earlier ones would probably be these like Assyrian ones and Babylonian ones, and then they get shallower over time. So that's just a useful bit of data if the next time you encounter a bathtub-shaped coffin, which I'm sure will eventually happen, if you were listening. Anyway, what's important is that the burial form is very localized to Mesopotamia and Iran, and that tells you something significantly. The most striking parallels for the Hacınebi Achaemenid burial can be seen in Iran, with the 4th century BC bronze bathtub coffin burial discovered on the Susa Acropole. Oh, sorry, this is our ceramic bathtub coffin from Hacınebi, and this is the one that was excavated in 1901 by Jacques de Morgan on the Susa Acropolis. And okay, it's definitely fancier. It's bronze instead of ceramic, and the grave goods are certainly more elaborate, but the basic set of materials in them, the alabastra, which you see here, and the forms of jewelry, the lobed earrings, there's so many similarities. It's really, it's quite striking. And we find more of these things. At the site of Lidar, about 50 kilometers upstream from Hacınebi, the excavator, Harold Hauptmann, found a bronze bathtub-shaped coffin inside a cist, and it even had this kind of metal object. It may have been a sistrum of some sort, but it appears to show a magus or a Zoroastrian priest on it, and also this signet ring. So it's, again, a very similar tradition, and all of these sites in the Euphrates Valley, like Lidar and Hacınebi, this is the westernmost extent of these bathtub-shaped coffins. Further down the Euphrates, at the site of Tel Barsip in Syria, again you find this same constellation of grave goods, of the penannular bracelets, alabastra, torques, which are kind of very, very high status necklace in the Persian Empire, all occurring in these bathtub burials. So the reason I'm showing all this to you is to show you that this constellation of grave goods is showing up all over the place, whether it's in Susa, in the heartland of the Persian Empire, or in the provinces, the western satrapies as far as the Euphrates. And that seems to be true regardless of the kind of burial form that's been used. This complex of goods is the same. It's occurring again and again. So these kinds of cist burials that we see are very informative, because these kinds of high status burials are present as well at this site here called Deve Huyuk. Where's Deve Huyuk? Right there, just west of the Euphrates, in the Sajur River Valley in North Syria. And here what we see are some very interesting things going on, because the burials here are cist burials with the same complex of grave goods, but they have lots of military equipment in them. They have things like, there's a range of very distinctive weaponry that the Persian army used. So these weapons, by the way, were all basically copied and adapted from the Scythian steppe nomads and incorporated into the Achaemenid arsenal. So you have the akinakes, the short sword or dagger, the sagaris battle axe, and the goritus, which is a combined bow case and quiver. That's what this warrior is wearing on his back, and you can see it here as well. So these weapons were all showing up at this Devehuyuk cemetery. And one interpretation was suggested by Roger Murray, and he suggested that at least some of the Devehuyuk burials, cyst burials, were those of an ethnically Persian or Median military garrison stationed along the Euphrates, for at least some of the burials. But the other group of burials at Devehuyuk, based on the Egypto-Phoenician style of jewelry and toiletry items, Murray suggested that if the soldiers buried at Devehuyuk were of Iranian origin, it's probable that many of the women buried there were local North Syrian Phoenician-related women. So the construction and contents of these elaborated cyst tombs at Devehuyuk are consistent with their identification as an elite mortuary form containing this assemblage of portable elite material culture that asserted an Achaemenid imperial identity independent of ethnicity. That's very important. So I want to draw a contrast between the terms Persian and Achaemenid, which might be like the contrast between Turk and Ottoman. That Ottoman is an imperial identity, whereas Turk is an ethnic identity. So an Albanian, a Greek, an Armenian, an Arab, or a Jew could be an Ottoman if they were subscribing to the broader cultural norms and social norms and political system of the Ottoman Empire. They could be an Ottoman, but they could never be a Turk. And I want to suggest that the contrast between Achaemenid and Persian is maybe not all that dissimilar. So the broad distribution of Achaemenid portable elite material culture, cutting across so many very different burial customs, that means something. It expressed different aspects of identity in the Persian Empire. And I think that these burial forms, the kinds of burials, like bathtubs versus these other forms, may reflect local ethnic differences, while the burial goods express this overarching elite identity that cross-cut ethnic divisions within the satrapies. What was the relationship between ethnicity and elite identity in the Persian Empire? In contrast with the later coercive practices of the Hellenistic period, the Achaemenids did not impose a specifically Persian cultural identity on the subject peoples of the empire. The state did not mandate the use of the Old Persian language and script, and in fact, they even used a foreign language, Imperial Aramaic, as the language of administration. And they reserved Old Persian almost exclusively for use in monumental inscriptions. The Persian kings made little effort to pressure the subject people into adopting specifically Persian beliefs and deities. And of course, Cyrus the Great is very famous for having, there's a good written record of this kind of record of toleration. So Achaemenid tolerance of cultural, religious, and linguistic diversity, it seems to have been, it's not because they were nice people, it was a deliberate political policy aimed at ensuring identity and ensuring stability and minimizing the threat of revolts. At the same time, you have to, it's very clear that the Persian elite seem to have been highly conscious of their distinctive cultural identity, as seen in the royal inscriptions of Darius, and he identifies himself very forcefully as an Achaemenid, a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, having an Aryan lineage. So on the one hand, the Persian elite were very ethnically self-conscious. On the other hand, as a matter of statecraft, they were very tolerant of diversity. for both administrative and cultural reasons, positions in the Persian court, satrapal organization, and the highest ranks of the military were all almost exclusively limited to members of what Pierre Briand has called the Persian ethno-class. The Achaemenids formally recognized ethno-linguistic differences so that the military units in the Persian army, when it was campaigning, they retained their own distinctive local dress. Imperial policy encouraged participation by subject groups and facilitated the creation of a pan-regional Achaemenid identity to attract the allegiance of local elites. And material culture played a very key role in this process because that's how you would identify yourself publicly. So it's worth noting that Achaemenid culture represented a very rapidly created imperial synthesis, drawing on stylistic elements from Scythia, Assyria, Egypt, Lydia, Greece, and other regions. Achaemenid monumental public art, palace organization, administrative systems, jewelry styles, cuneiform script, and glyptic all derive from traditional Iranian, Neo-Assyrian, and probably Neo-Babylonian models. So this Achaemenid imperial style was characteristic of the Persian court and of the elite Persian administration. But at the same time, this subset of portable objects in this style had a much broader distribution beyond the Persian ethno-elite. The integration of the subject peoples into the broader social fabric of the Persian Empire was expressed most visibly through the widespread distribution of this koine of portable material culture used by local elites. So the key elements in this shared language were the use of distinctive styles of prestige goods like alabastra and bronze mirrors, scarabs, seals, earrings with knob decorations, and the kinds of things I've been showing you. And some kind of ranking existed even within the broader rubric of elite material culture. So bracelets with animal head terminals, they're all over the place. But by contrast, torques of precious metal, these necklaces of precious metal, are very rare, and they seem to have been worn only by the highest ranking Achaemenid elites, whether they were ethnic Persians or Medes, or the highest ranking local elites among the subject peoples. There are several textual and artistic examples showing that the Persian kings bestowed torques as marks of special favor on subordinates, even non-Persians, whom they wished to reward or honor. So the use of this material culture, this elite material culture, seems to have identified a person as having a dual identity, as both a loyal subject of the empire and as a member of its ruling class. And the international character of this material culture can be seen in the fact that it was a distinctive hybrid expression in which Achaemenid styles combined with recognizably local styles. So I'm trying to make the argument to you that it's local people and not just Persians who are identifying themselves through the use of this material culture. And the best way to prove that, or in support of that argument, is to look at these weird kinds of hybrids. So one of the best examples of it that I could find is this piece here. So I already mentioned that these stone-carved alabastra were very common in elite material culture across the Persian Empire, right? But this, first of all, it's made in silver and not carved out of stone. It's an Egyptian form used by the Persian Empire, but it's covered with purely Lydian decorations. So there's no way that a Persian, son of a Persian, an Aryan, son of an Achaemenid, son of an Achaemenid, would never use something like this. This is very clearly a local elite asserting their commonality with the Achaemenid Empire, and yet at the same time expressing a local identity. So it's someone who could, depending on the circumstance, assert one identity or another. And that's, let's be honest, that is something that is very common in America as well. When I was an undergraduate at Yale, the president was known on the campus of Yale University as A. Bartlett Giamatti, whereas in the community of New Haven, he was known as Angelo B. Giamatti. So you can assert one or another aspect of your identity in a very WASPy institution or in an Italian-American community, depending on what aspects you decide you want to foreground. So this composite, contextually dependent identity was the key to co-opting these local elites into the Achaemenid Empire. And we can see it's not just this kind of thing happening in Lydia. There are wonderful examples from Egypt. So one of the most iconic elements of Iranian Achaemenid Persian material culture are these magnificent silver and gold rhytons. You see those, you instantly know, oh yeah, that's Persian. But look at this tomb of Pet-Osiris, where the wall reliefs show craft specialists producing what? They're producing, these are clearly Egyptian guys, I think, right? There's not going to be any argument about that. And they're manufacturing Achaemenid-style rhytons here and here. And here the guy has just finished one, and he's showing it to his supervisor. So local elites are producing Achaemenid material culture for the use by themselves, by local elites. So there would have been, in these composite cultural identities, there would have been no real contradiction between being a Lydian or an Egyptian and being an active participant in Achaemenid material society. So we have the tomb of Pet-Osiris, and then we have this gentleman, Uja Harosnet, and his statue, oops, let me go back. The inscription on it, well, first, the statue itself, he's wearing a Persian penannular bracelet with zoomorphic terminals. He's wearing sort of Persian-style dress, and his inscription makes it completely clear who he is. He identifies himself as an Egyptian who had been a high official in the previous Egyptian administration before Cambyses' conquest of Egypt, and then Cambyses just simply hired him on as a very high official, the chief physician. So the man had a composite identity as a local elite and as an Achaemenid. And one of the other really fine examples of this is the statue of Ptahhotep. I think this one's in the Brooklyn Museum. And what's so great about it is, I mentioned that the Persian king would give torques, these very fancy necklaces, as a mark of special favor to the highest elites. That's a golden torque. I think this one is from the Oxus treasure in Afghanistan. And look, what is Ptahhotep wearing around his neck but a perfect Achaemenid torque, and yet underneath it, he has an Egyptian pectoral. So it's hard to think of a more perfect example of this contextual dual identity where local elites are asserting an Achaemenid identity. So when we take it all together, one identity or another could have been expressed or emphasized more forcefully depending on the specific social context of interaction. So the takeaway is that in the Persian Empire, you really could have it both ways. So attempts to identify people of Persian or Median ancestry, if you only base it on material culture, they're not going to work. That's the key thing to remember. So what do you do in that situation? It's very problematical. So for instance, I already mentioned that Roger Murray mentioned certain kinds of weaponry, like the Akhenates dagger, as being distinctively Persian, but in fact, the Achaemenids got that style of weaponry from the Scythians. So these were very widely used weapons, and to identify people as Persian just based on their weapons is not necessarily going to work. That's true with the Akhenates, it's true with the Sagaris battle axe, and it's true with the Goritus quiver as well. So if you can't use material culture, then how are you going to address the question of ethnicity and identity? The complex relationship between a Persian-Iranian ethnic identity and the broader notion of an Achaemenid social elite, it emerges very clearly when we look at the Achaemenid military, right? Because I've already mentioned, and we all know, that the Achaemenids drew on military units from all over their empire. So it's a great way to look at this relationship between local ethnicity and imperial political identity. So Herodotus and Xenophon give most of the limited textual evidence for Persian military organization. And there's a big difference between standing military garrisons, which were there for the long term, and these sort of large levies of troops that you'd pull together when you wanted to invade Greece or something like that. So the standing garrisons are really where you want to look if you want to understand this relationship. And the Greek sources suggest that there was a clear ethnic division between the rank and file garrison troops and their commanders. The common soldiers were local populations or mercenaries drawn from other parts of the empire, or occasionally Iranians. But by contrast, with few exceptions, the higher-ranking officers were almost exclusively ethnic Persians. When Greek authors mention the names of army commanders, they're overwhelmingly Persian, and often members of noble families in garrisons at Doriscus, Aeon, Sardis, Gaza, Elephantini, and Memphis. And the Elephantini data are especially valuable. Elephantini is an island in the Nile close to the southern border between Egypt and Sudan. And it was meant to guard the southern reaches of the Egyptian state from the Nubians. And these are 5th century papyri from the Achaemenid garrison of Elephantini. And the soldiers at Elephantini, we know this from the very well-preserved papyri, the soldiers at Elephantini, the lower-ranking ones, were Jews, Arameans, Babylonians, Caspians, Khwarezmians, so that's up near the Aral Sea in the eastern satrapies, Medes, and Persians. Although the ethnic origins of the actual foot soldiers and lower-ranking officers seem to have been very diverse, the upper ranks, centurions, degel commanders, Rab Chayla, and Frataraka, were almost entirely staffed by commanders with clearly Iranian names. So this is a breakdown, and this is work by Bezalel Porton and other scholars, Tavernier as well. So if you look, this is going from top to bottom. The highest ranking of the foremost, Frataraka and Rab Chayla, Degel commanders, all of them have just very straightforward Persian or Median names. And then when you get to the very bottom, the grunts, it's, mostly Jews. So you have this very clear ethnic ranking system in the Persian military in its long-standing garrisons. So the presence of Persian officers and troops in these garrisons is consistent with the archaeological evidence as well. I've already noted Muri's analysis of the Devehuyuk burial practices that led him to conclude that the cemetery was used for the burial of a Persian military garrison, the higher officers, and their local Syrian wives. And Devehuyuk may provide a useful analog for the Hacınebi burials. So this is the contrast I'm trying to draw between burial forms, which are very local, and burial goods, which are all across the empire. The Hacınebi burials are great examples of burial practices and provide good examples of Achaemenid material culture from archaeological contexts. But that gets us back to the original question, who was buried in the Hacınebi Achaemenid burials? And the answer is not clear-cut. The burial goods in the Hacınebi tombs were part of a set of what I've called portable elite material culture that marked a political identity as being an Achaemenid elite and was shared across the empire. But the forms of burial are much more local and localized than the grave goods that they contained. So even though cis tombs were widespread, the use of bathtub coffins, that's a very Persian thing. or Mesopotamian thing, to be honest, both Persian or Mesopotamian. We know that Persian military garrisons were stationed along key routes of communication. Given the location of Hacınebi at a very strategic location where the royal road crossed the Euphrates on its way to Sardis, that's a key choke point. It's a very important place. And so it's reasonable to conclude that at least that these burials are of two high-ranking individuals within the Achaemenid military. The names and titles preserved in the Elephantine papyri show that pattern. So the grave goods and burial forms are consistent with an interpretation that the Sis tomb at Hacınebi held a high-ranking soldier of Persian median ethnic identity, and it's quite possible that the female buried in the bathtub coffin might have been a Mesopotamian or possibly an Iranian spouse of the high-ranking Persian median officer. So ultimately, the Hacınebi data give us a chance to look at what held the empire together. The political model is very clearly expressed metaphorically with the idea of all the subject peoples literally holding up the throne of Persia. And this gives us, the Hacınebi burials give us a look at how they held it up. And they held it up by co-opting local elites who were given a partial membership in the ruling class. They could never reach the highest parts of it, but they sure could reach up to the medium levels of it. The very highest and most sensitive positions would always have been held by ethnic Persians and Medes, at least as far as we can see from the textual data from Elephantine and from the archaeological data. Now, look, ultimately, we can only speak in terms of probabilities, but when analyzed with close attention to their archaeological, political, and artistic context, the Hacınebi tombs highlight the complex hybrid identities and cultural koine that linked Persian and non-Persian elites across the cosmopolitan Achaemenid Empire. Thank you.